We'll be starting. As per usual, you guys know the drill. There's a sign-in sheet that is circulating. I will be James. This is James. I'll be passing on flyers with our programming for this semester. It's the same flyer. Don't get you excited. What else? I would like to open up with wishing all the ladies here Happy International Women's Day. So now that we got that out of the way, let's get started. They say that beginning is the most important part of every work, and I thought about this quote because today it won't be me introducing the speaker, so I effectively delegated the beginning to Maria Lozano here, who will then introduce Ofelia García, who will be talking about translanguaging. My work here is done, so I will pass the floor on to you.
Thank you very much. Well, again, what a great way to celebrate International Women's Day than to have a woman that is leading scholar in the education field speaking to us today. My name is Maria Lozano, as Simon said. I'm faculty in the Spanish department at García College, and it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Ofelia García. She will be talking to us about shifting perceptions of bilingual education and how to better address the needs of our students. Dr. Garcia's work was instrumental in my dissertation, and this is why I wanted to introduce her today. One of the many contributions of Dr. Garcia's research to the field of education is her work with constructs, with names, with labels that are given to students who speak other languages than English. How we label people is instrumental as they communicate the perceptions we have of certain groups. In the case of bilingual education, we have been giving labels to immigrant students in the public school system for decades, referring to their limited English speaking abilities, or LESA in their late 60s, or limited English proficiency, or LEP, in their mid-70s, to English language learners, or ELLs, in the 80s. Up to very recently, that these labels only focus on the deficiency this group has instead of their possibilities. In the 2000, the term emerging bilinguals was coined by Dr. García as an equalizer term in the teaching field, referring to the students' potential in developing their bilingualism, not just looking at what they don't have, but what they can achieve. In her article, Emerging Bilinguals and TESOL, What is in a Name?, Dr. García states that the term places the students in a bilingual continuum, or more or less accessibility to the target language. Her later work is with the term of translanguaging that we will be hearing today. Dr. García is a professor at the Urban Education and Hispanic and Brazilian Literatures and Languages at the Graduate Center in CUNY, which I just heard that she retired this semester. Okay. Her research interest includes language, literacy, culture, and bilingualism in education. Please give her a warm welcome to Dr. García's welcome.
So it's wonderful to be here. And I'm very grateful to Simon especially for his talking me into coming here. As you just heard, I just retired, and I had decided I was going to take a sabbatical from all speaking and all lectures. But Simon sat next to me on a train ride all the way from Princeton here. When I was very sick, but he persuaded me to say yes. So here I am today. So thank you, Simon, for the invitation, and thank you to Stefan and the Language Resource Center for giving me this opportunity, and for all of you who are doing the real work. You know, sometimes we think about these things, we write about these things, we speak about these things, but we don't do the work like you do. So I always have a lot of admiration for teachers of languages and classroom teachers, because they're the ones that are really interacting with the learners. So what I want to do with you today is basically three things, and I try to think about what an audience like this might be interested in, because you are teaching adults. My work, like you heard, is mostly in schools and with children. But the concepts, the constructs that we're working with, I think are transferable. So I'm going to speak to you for a long time, for about an hour maybe, 45 minutes to an hour. And then I'm hoping that you have a lot of questions about how does this translate to your own work. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to help reflect on what language is. And given the shift that I'm going to propose about what language is, what does this mean for your teaching? Secondly, I'm going to reflect on what bilingualism is, and then given this shift, what does it mean for your teaching? And then thirdly, I'm going to introduce this strange word that has marked my scholarship in the last 10 years at least, and think together about what this might mean for your teaching, right? So we're going to do it in three parts. So I start with language, and one of the problems with the ways in which we all think about language, and I'm with an audience that really cares about language, and we became interested in teaching languages because we were interested in the structure of language, right? We were interested in this system that we call language, right? And that is usually what you have in your heads, right? That is the way in which people think about language as just all of these, what we have learned to call named languages, right? I see Swahili here, and Romanian and Russian and others, but certainly the idea that languages are just autonomous structure, a structure of lexical, morphological, syntactic, and phonological features that holds together. And this is definitely what we think of when we think about language in schools. We think about these structures that we put together, and when we think about teaching, sometimes this is what we focused on. And certainly this has a long tradition of why we think about language in this way. We can start with the history of Ferdinand de Saussure, who was the founder of modern linguistics, but certainly he always talked about language being a self-standing, integrated system of structures, and he talked about la langue being the conventions, the rules that make up the system that is always independent of individual users. And then we have, of course, Noam Chomsky, who again talked about language as if it was just structures, and the idea that it was context-free, that it was universal, that it could be extended through transformational rules, and that all this diversity that we hear is illusory. I'm going to talk to you about language from a different perspective, a perspective that I learned. I was trained by Joshua Fishman. One of the things I want to tell you is that our most generous professors are the ones that allow you to think independently. And one of the things that I always think of when I speak is to make sure that I remember that I stand on that foundation in order to extend it. Because as he once said to me, every group and every generation has to make meaning for themselves. And certainly what I was being taught as language, as bilingualism, did not make sense to me personally. So I arrived from Cuba to New York City. I've lived in New York City since I was 10 years old. You can just imagine how long that is before all of you were born. But so my life experience has led me to think of language and bilingualism differently. So I sort of ground myself in the language ideology of the vaccine circle. We have someone here, Alla, who teaches Russian. So these were, of course, Russian linguists, Bakhtin and Voloshinov, who believed that language was dialogic, that it was formed in the process of social interaction with people, and that, of course, being in the middle of the Russian Revolution and the Stalin period, started thinking about how language really registers ideologies, right? So the idea that language is always dialogic and formed within these ideologies. And Martin always said that language was bound to the context in which it exists, and it emerges from the actions of the speakers who always have certain ideological positionings, right? So the way in which we language has to do with our context and our ideologies. And Voloshinov says that language acquires life in concrete verbal communication and not in the abstract linguistic system of language forms, nor in the individual psyche of speakers. So taking it one step further then, I can give you a whole history, but I won't, because you will then fall asleep. But I came upon the work of two Chilean biologists, not linguists, biologists, Madugana and Varela, who basically in the 1970s started talking about not la lengua, the language, but as an action, lenguajear, right? To language, languaging. And they say in the translation, they call the translation to English calls it languaging, and they say that it refers to the activity in which those who interact mutually orient ourselves to each other and to a subject. So that is the shift between language as a structure to this action of languaging. And this was followed up by the work of A.L. Becker, someone that some of you might know. He used to talk about it, humanist linguistics. He worked in Java, and so he had this other idea of what language was. And he also talked about languaging as this ongoing process that can never be accomplished, right? Because we can never accomplish language, that is always being created as we interact in the world lingually. And he said that learning a language is about taking all language and pushing it into a new context. So a different concept of languaging as a verb. And this is the way in which many of us have started to think about language. Alistair Pennicoat talks about languaging being an activity rather than a structure, something we do rather than a system we just draw on, as a material part of social and cultural life rather than an abstract entity. So the idea is that language is not something we have, it's something that we perform, that we do, because we're all semiotic beings, we're all beings that try to make meaning, and we bring together in what Pennicoat calls an assemblage, a wide range of linguistic, multimodal, social, semiotic, and environmental resources to make meaning with others, right? As we engage in the world. So it's the idea that the focus is not on the language as a structure, but on the creative and critical use of the linguistic resources to mediate our very complex activities. So this is the way that I see language or languaging. I see the fact that people draw from this repertoire, from this semiotic repertoire, that of course is made up of linguistic features, but also has multimodal features, gestures, etc., right? The emotional, our social histories, who we are, our linguistic ethnographies, the way in which we live our lives, and also some cognitive also, because I think that one of the problems is we always throw away the baby with the bathwater, and I like to always think of, I draw a lot from a Portuguese philosopher, his name is Sousa de Santos, who talks about epistemologies of the South, and he talks about the fact that we have abyssal, what he calls abyssal thinking, the idea that we only see what's on the surface and everything else we don't see, is invisible. But then he says that that has to be brought to the top also. It can't be left at the bottom. But it has to be simultaneous, right? That it's not that one is on top of the other epistemology, but that both simultaneously build something. So I say that because sometimes I get a lot of pushback when I say that there's something cognitive about language also, because people want to insist that it's a social practice, it's language. Yes, it is a social practice, it's an action, it's in our interaction, but we are drawing from all of these features that we have, some linguistic, some not, what we know already, who we are, all our gestures, but also that involves some cognitive action. So I'm not ready to give up all the cognitive stuff, right? I think it has to be put alongside each other. And I think what's important is to remember that the way in which language works is we have all this repertoire, and we select the features that offer the best hints for the interaction with others, so to make sure that there's meaning. And then the listener constructs or not the message. Now this is very important, because we as language teachers are always worried about the speaker, right? And we want our students to speak. But it turns out that the listener has a very important task in this communication, that there's an interaction between the way that the listener reacts to the input and not, right? So teachers have a very important role in this whole activity, because unless you're listening with a generous ear, then your students are not going to be able to really assemble the resources that they need in order to communicate. So, important to say that all of these components of languaging are inseparable, that this becomes a unitary repertoire of signs, that we assemble these components, and that the listening subjects are most important in languaging. And that's why we find that many minoritized speakers are never listened to as legitimate, are never given the legitimation of it being what they say is appropriate, because the listeners refuse to listen to them. And I'm saying that because we're talking about how difficult it is to get students engaged in language education. But it is important for some students to take courses, and it's important for those who do not to listen to what is happening. So, we have to always work on the two levels. So, just to remember, right, that languaging is a social and cognitive interaction with others. So, how does then this shift from the way that I've been viewing language, how does this impact language education? What does that do to all of us who teach language? An important principle for me is that the more that you will leverage the student's ability to do language, that is to language, with all the features of the community repertoire, the more opportunity they will have to successfully use a school language, right? So this is important, because we always think we can only, it's not me, right? No, we can only allow certain features. We're teaching Russian only in Russian, but whether you see it or not, the students have it in their heads, in their lives, in their bodies, and they're holding on to these other features. And the idea is that the more opportunities they have, the better it's going to be. So, acquisition of a language is not just an acquisition of a grammatical structure or even a standardized language. Acquisition of a language refers to this social and cognitive interaction, and these are some of the things that I would say are important. In listening and speaking, students have to be able to comprehend knowledge and ideas and present them both individually and collaboratively. In writing, they should be able to produce text types for various purposes, opinion, informative, explanatory, narrative pieces. In reading, they should be able to provide text-based evidence, to make inferences, identify main ideas, relationships, recognize the craft and the structure, associate knowledge and ideas from multiple sources in text. So this is a way of shifting the attention that we give to language as a structure to what can you do with language, which I think is what we should be all focusing on in a language education class. Okay, get to the second topic. Are you with me? Okay.
We are listening.
So the second topic is, what is then? Now that we've gone through languaging, doing language, what about bilingualism? Well, the problem is that the study of bilingualism has also been constructed with this idea that languages were just structures, autonomous structures, and that what you do when you become bilingual, when we all teach the other languages, we add a second structure to this first structure that is completely separate from each other. Right? So that's the traditional idea. It's a traditional idea that we have lived with for many, many, many years, at least since the mid-20th century. When I started studying bilingualism, there was not a lot of work, but there was important work. But in a way, they reified the idea that bilingualism was simply the addition of two languages, right? I like the bicycle image, the idea that what we were told by Wallace Lambert at McGill University is that bilingualism was additive, that is, you start with one first language, you add a second language, and you end up with L1 and L2. Or, if you're a minoritized being, you usually go to school, you have an L1 at home. In school, you are added a second language. That means that they subtract the first language and you end up being a monolingual dominant language. So that is the traditional understanding of bilingualism that we have always worked with. Now, this has consequences. The idea that we need to be balanced, right? When we know that it's impossible for all of us to be two monolinguals in one. We cannot do that. It's a theoretical impossibility. And that the bilingualism does not connote just two separate structures, but it is always emergent. I like the word emergent, right? Because it reminds us that none of us are ever complete. I mean, if we were complete language learners, we wouldn't have to continue learning a language. We wouldn't take English courses when we came to the university because we already knew the language. But there are new uses of language that we have to learn, right? So the idea that it's always emergent and that it's bilingualism really is about the interaction, the use, the doing with all the language resources that we have. So, we have been taught to think that people have a first language and a second language because of this additive bilingualism idea. Whereas we know that many of us cannot define what is our first language. I always say, I can tell you which one I learned first. Chronologically, I can tell you I learned Spanish first. But I cannot tell you which one, or the definitions are different depending on who thinks my first language is, how I think which is my first language, which one I use first, more, which one I feel more confident in, which one I identify with. These are all different definitions of what is an L1. But what you have to remember is because the study of bilingualism was based on monolinguals, right? It was what I call a monoglossic bilingualism. Then what happened was we understood this just as, all right, so this is a monolingual, a bilingual is just a double monolingual, right? And in that book, which I wrote in 2009, where I started examining bilingual education, I started thinking, no, bilingualism is a lot more complex than simply additive. That bilingualism is dynamic, because for those of us, that's why there's a banyan tree there, South Asian tree, because the roots are many, they go in many different directions. And for those of us who have grown up bilinguals, we know that there is no division, that there is, these are different manifestations, different actions, but coming from the same trunk. So bilingualism is a lot more dynamic, right? So this is another image that I've used all the time. The idea that bilingualism is not simply two valence wheels in a bicycle, but it's more like an all-terrain vehicle. We adapt to the communicative situation that we have. If languaging is about the actions we do with others, then of course what we're going to do is adapt in some ways. Sometimes our wheels are going in the wrong direction. Sometimes one wheel is going this way, the other was going that way. But it's never even, because the terrain, the communicative terrain is not even. It depends who we're speaking to, where we're speaking, with whom we're speaking, and all these other things. So I like to think of dynamic bilingualism being about adapting to the communicative terrains like feet, right? We adapt to the terrain. Sometimes we lift one, sometimes we put one down, but the structure remains the same. In other words, what I want to emphasize is that those of us who are bilingual, and those of you who are turning bilingual, are not just adding another structure. They are integrating the features, the new features of the language that you're teaching to their own structure. And unless we do that, I doubt that anybody's going to learn another language. Because I don't want to be told that I'm a second language speaker. I don't want to be told even that I'm a heritage language speaker, because that robs me of my right to say that I'm as native as anybody else. And native speaker is also a problem, right? Because we know that native speakers is a category that has nothing to do with language use. It has to do with privilege, right? And we say this teacher is native, or this person is native, and this person is non-native, in order to exclude and make differences. And if you don't believe me, you can read a book by a man whose name I can't remember right now, because I can't remember anything anymore. With a B, I can't remember his name, who starts out by telling us the story of a newspaper in Singapore that advertises for English native speakers. And you know what happened the next day? There was a long line of people applying for the job, but they were all Chinese ethnics. And so they turned them away, and the next day they ran the same ad saying, Caucasian native English speakers needed, right? So I think it's very important for us who are language teachers to deconstruct this idea of the native speaker that gives privilege to some and that excludes others. So I always say I didn't get this out of my head. It wasn't my readings. It was my lived experience, and my lived experience has been as a teacher and as a researcher in classrooms for a very long time. And I was sitting next to a child, a 5th grader, one time in what is called in the United States a dual language. I say this because I hate that word. Dual language doesn't mean anything anyway. We used to call them developmental bilingual programs all over the world. That's what they're called. But here we decided they were dual because the idea is that unless you teach a language with English speakers, children don't learn, which is an absurd idea, but anyway, that's the idea. But this child, and of course what they did in this classroom is there was a strict language allocation where one day was in English and the next day was in Spanish. And children always know that I'm interested in language, so they talk to me. And he said to me, even though Spanish runs through my heart, English rules my veins. And that day, I knew that what we were doing was wrong, because it was not speaking to him as a bilingual child. He was himself. He had one system, but they did not allow him to speak English in the Spanish part, in the Spanish day, or Spanish in the English day. They were robbing him really of his bilingual identity and his bilingual ability to be. So the idea, of course, is that we always try to think that these are separate languages, basically because they have to do with nation-state building, and they have to do with issues of having colonized populations. But within the speaker, there's a lot more going on than simply these two halves. So I think that's what's important. So here's the same diagram that I showed you before, except now with bilinguals it gets a little more complicated because the listeners change. Sometimes they're monolingual listeners of one language or the other. Then we have to select our features carefully because we want to be able to communicate. But sometimes they're bilingual listeners, like at home. I don't speak this way because it doesn't make any sense to speak this way, right? Because I don't have to select features as separately. I can do it. I certainly can do it. I can read, write Spanish, French also, speak it, but I cannot, I do not have to, because it's, my listeners are all bilinguals at home and in families. So it gets more complicated, and sometimes you have two. So all of us who are bilingual know that we cannot have dinner at home in only one language, because there's always someone that comes in that speaks one language or the other, right? My son-in-law doesn't speak Spanish, my mother doesn't speak English, so we're always accommodating to the context in which we speak. So the idea then is that bilingualism is not simply additive or subtractive, but reflects its continuum of features. And continuum is a good word, right? The idea that this is a continuum of linguistic, multimodal, cognitive, social, emotional features that respond to the social interactions at hand, and that these performances are dynamically negotiated in the interactions as we adapt to the opportunities we have, and as listeners legitimate these performances or not, right? If you are all sleeping now, I will do something different. Okay. So just like individual bilingualism was always seen as just L1 and L2, and it still continues to be seen that way, the other aspect is the societal aspects of bilingualism. Again, I was taught by the best of the land, right? Joshua Fishman. But his big problem, his big issue, was that in order to have a stable bilingual society, you have to have a diglossic relationship between the two languages, right? You have to have functional compartmentalization, he always used to say, right? So that one language is spoken in one, for example, the home, the other language is spoken in school. But of course, this is a description of what's happening without considering the power dynamics of why they were keeping these languages at home, right? And I think it's very important for us to differentiate between what we describe exists and question why there are those differences and why some languages are kept separate and at home and stigmatized instead of bringing them to the forefront. So it's clear to me that diglossia is not a concept that works in the 21st century. It's clear to me that it only works when we are oppressing language minoritized people, so we don't let them speak. Once you give them a voice, those languages come out of those borders that we have established, right? And the same thing with the study of language maintenance and language shift. I was put this into my head for years and years and years. But I always said, it doesn't quite make sense, because to maintain a language as a museum piece is, again, to think of language as a structure. Once language is used in a community, it changes, it adapts, it's an act, right? So I like to speak not of language maintenance, but of language sustainability. I do think that endangered languages have to be protected, no doubt. But they don't have to be isolated, because speakers are not isolated, right? My children have to live in this society. I can't keep them just speaking Spanish, and I wouldn't want them to speak Spanish as people did in Cuba and Puerto Rico, from where the family comes from, right? So you have to be able to adapt to the context. So I think the idea of language sustainability is one that you should all work on and think about how language actions are in ecological relation with the context in which we do it. So the second part of the second part is this idea of, well, then how does this understanding, this shift from traditional bilingualism to the more dynamic bilingualism that I've been talking about, and the realization that in all constructions of language there have been issues of power imposition, of hegemony, and of trying to make sure that some people are contained while others are lifted. So how does this change your language teaching? Well, one thing is not to see students as incomplete, right? We have talked about that already. I talk about emergent bilinguals because I know that in teaching these students, they are going to be emerging as bilinguals. And it's very important to me, especially when you work in schools, because there are many, many TESOL teachers out there, maybe some of your ESL teachers here, but unless you own bilingualism, you're not doing these students any favor, because these students are going to become bilingual by your teaching them English. So it's important to remember that this is something for all of us. So beyond this traditional thinking about languages as a structure that you teach, whether you teach it as foreign, as second, as heritage, I don't care how you teach it. It's important to think about these, how we need to deconstruct these programs, right? So let me just take you through what exists in the United States, right? So for majority speakers, you have foreign language classrooms, you have bilingual education classrooms that are in immersion in the other language, and you have these dual language classrooms. Some of them are one way, you know, when in 2002 No Child Left Behind was passed, the word bilingual was deleted from every place in which the act mentioned bilingual, right? And the Bilingual Education Act was completely deleted, and it was called English Language Acquisition, right? So, so one of the things that happened, and as you know, there were many states, California, Massachusetts, Arizona, that declared bilingual education illegal. It couldn't be done. So a lot of states and a lot of programs in hiding behind the name started calling them dual language programs. So there exists in the United States right now some programs that are basically for Korean students or Spanish, Latinx students, but certainly they're one way with the continuum, because you can never have, you know, it's the other thing. We have Korean 1, Korean 2, Korean 3, Korean 4, and as you know, it's a continuum, right? We have students with all kinds of abilities, and depending on the task that you give them, they're either more proficient or less proficient. And then there are, most of the programs, especially in New York City, are what I call two-way program, which means that 50% of the students have to be English speakers, and then the other 50% have to be labeled English language learners, right? So it's a strange way of constructing bilingual programs in the United States. For minoritized speakers, of course, there's submersion in English most of the time. There's some programs that give special support, allow push-out. There are transitional bilingual education programs that give some support in the first language. And then there are the heritage language classes, always at the secondary and tertiary level, right? So higher education, high schools do it, otherwise it doesn't exist. We sort of erase it when they're little, and then when they're in high school or universities, we want them to become interested in languages other than English, which is a problem, right? Because if we have not created that linguistic tolerance, that listening ability, that linguistic tolerance when people are young, and they're going to have a harder time when they're older. So what do they all have in common? What they all have in common is whether they're really monolingual or bilingual, is this that Jim Cummins and that Stefan talked to me about before, calls the two solitudes, right? This idea that they always have to be separate, this diglossic idea. But if language use is in one coordinated performance, then how do we put it all together so that bilingualism is addressed differently? So one of the things that we have been working on is how do you build these, going beyond these diglossic language spaces, so that there's some flexibility in using or doing or developing bilingualism in classrooms. How do we stretch to incorporate other things? And that is where translanguaging comes in, and now I come to the third part. You still with me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So, one of the problems, of course, is that I always think that the study of the languaging of bilinguals deserves a different term. And the term that I have come up with, but it's not the only term, is translanguaging. To me, the trans is very important. The trans has to do with transcending, right? It has to do with transcending named languages. It has to do with transcending just a linguistic, to make sure that when we teach and when we communicate, we really encompass the multimodal, the cognitive, the social, the emotional environmental act of languaging. Now, it's important to know that translanguaging has a different epistemology from bilingualism. Translanguaging was coined in, using Gloria Anzaldua's term, it was coined in the borderlands. It was actually a Welsh educator, he was just a teacher, Ken Williams, someone I know, who said one day, what we're doing with the Welsh students in the Welsh bilingual classrooms and in the Welsh mother tongue classrooms doesn't make any sense. Because these children are really bilingual, and again, we are separating the Welsh from the English, and these children have to be bilingual Welsh speakers. They don't have to be Welsh speakers and English speakers. They have to be bilingual Welsh speakers. And he started experimenting with a pedagogy in which he used one language as input and the other language as output. That meant that, for example, the children were asked to read in Welsh, but then they were able to discuss in English, or vice versa. All of those combinations were possible. So it's important for you to realize that translanguaging was coined in the borderland by Ken Williams, translated in Welsh, by the way. It was translated into English by Colin Baker. And it's important to me because from the very beginning, translanguaging had in its foundations the idea that language, in this case English, had been used to marginalize the Welsh. So from the very beginning, there were critical political aspects to translanguaging, which I think is what makes it different from plurilingual approaches and other kinder bilingual approaches. So this is a definition that we came up recently. Translanguaging is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of native languages. If named languages exist because they've been constructed by nation states, and they're building their nation states, they've been constructed in the process of colonization, then what would happen if we looked at what people do with language beyond these boundaries that have been imposed, right? So this is another definition. It refers to the fluid and adaptive language practices of bilinguals and the pedagogical approach that leverages those practices to develop those desired informal school settings, whether monolingual or bilingual. And I want to say that because people always misunderstand me and say, oh, you want people to speak that the way, no. I mean, I want people to be respected and to leverage what it is that they bring into a classroom. And then once you do that, then you can pull the other way. So this is an image, a metaphor that we use in our work. We call it the translanguaging corriente. The translanguaging corriente is what always exists in classrooms, right? You're talking about something, I'm talking about something right now, some of you may be, I don't know where, somewhere else, right? So there's always something that's on the surface and then something that's at the bottom. With bilingual students, you always have what they're saying at the surface, but there's a lot more going on the bottom, right? And I always say translanguaging is not about building a bridge. Everybody understands about building a bridge. You build a bridge between the home and the school. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being in the corriente with the minoritized students, not being, and of course, you have to touch each shore, right? You have to touch one shore and the other because they also have to be there. But when you teach, the question is, how do you place yourself within that corriente with the students? So this is a diagram I've used in my book, Bilingual, sort of trying to explain the difference between traditional bilingualism as just two autonomous languages, an L1 with features that are only those of the L1, to an L2 with features that are that of the L2. And then Jim Cummins' idea of the common underlying proficiency, which brings the two languages together, but still they're separate systems. And to the translanguaging perspective, which basically says that all of us have one communicative repertoire that have features that are ours. They're not English or Spanish or Korean or French. They're ours, right? And that we use depending on who we're talking to. So, just to make it clear, because I know this is difficult, right? I think what the problem is that we always talk about bilingualism as thinking about two named languages as these standardized conventions that belong to nation states and that schools teach and test. And I want to say that that is important. The problem is we always start there. And what I want to urge you to do is prioritize the other end, that internal perspective of the speaker. The idea that languages are not out there, that languages are within us as a semiotic means to make meaning, that's a unitary meaning-making system that is always with us. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, sometimes you hear it, sometimes you don't, but it's always with us because we live in this entanglement of worlds and words, and it's very important in teaching because you don't have this problem, but teachers in elementary schools, in high schools, have this problem all the time because they're continuously assessing students as if they were monolinguals. And think of how unfair that is, because a monolingual child has at his or her disposal mostly their entire repertoire, right, when they're assessed. But a bilingual child has less than half of the repertoire when they're assessed, right? So you're not getting a whole picture. You're not assessing the child. You're only assessing the language, and then you say, oh, they don't have the capacity, they're inferior, they need remedial education, they can't be educated, They cannot get into a good high school, they cannot get into a good university, and the cycle continues, and it all starts with our definition of what language is. I always look at these little kindergartners full of life, full of creativity, full of criticality, full of potential to be engineers and doctors, and then all of a sudden they're given the stupid test and they're told that they are English language learners and they're put in remedial classes and that's the end of them, or they're told that they speak English inappropriately when it is their only language, right? So instead of thinking how are they using language to make meaning, not what are the characteristics of their language that makes it legitimate or not. So I think it's just a change of mentality, right? So this is it, right? The idea that we're talking about one full repertoire, which is socially constructed as different languages. I want to say this again, one more time. Languages have social reality. They have a lot of social reality. They're important for us, right? They're important for the people we teach, they're important for the kids, but they do not have psycholinguistic realities. Not like if we have in one side, one language with some features, and the other side, other languages with some features. They don't have a psycholinguistic reality, and I think that's what's important. Let's skip this. So people ask me all the time, well, what's the difference with code switching? Well, code switching, and again, I was full of this literature too, but you know, it's time to give it up, right? Because code switching is looking at language from the external perspective, right? Translanguaging looks at language from what speakers do with language. I used to say, no longer is it possible, because I'm sure that Google heard me, because it used to be, and you probably don't remember this, that if you texted with an iPhone, you had to put the global, you have to press the global key to change keyboards. Now, the text recognizes the language in which you're writing. So for example, someone like me, that when I text my family, I never text in either English or Spanish, but I text in both, right? What we might call both. I always had to go back and forth, right? And I always say translanguaging is, if we were recognized as having this repertoire that enables us to communicate without having to continuously name it as one language or the other. So that's the difference. So the last part before you fall asleep. So what does this mean for language classrooms? I think what it means is that all the traditional pedagogical practices have always separated languages. And the translanguaging pedagogical practices still give spaces where one language is used or the other language is used. Because after all, again, because we don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, comprehensible input. Who was comprehensible input? You know him. Gratian, a million years ago, right? Still important, still important. The idea that students have to make meaning with that language, still important. But you have to be able to separate the process from the product. Sometimes you might want to say, all right, so the product has to be written in Russian. But to get to the product, there is no reason why they cannot use all their resources, including Google Translate, don't get alarmed, but or English in their discussion as they write their essay in Swahili, right? How are they going to get there? If you insist that from the very first time they write it in Swahili only, then they're only going to be able to repeat. They don't have any way to generate ideas, etc. So the idea is, how do you keep the separate spaces, but also build in some flexibility? That's why I like that curtain. Let's mix it up a little bit. So in these classrooms, I think the idea is that there's this dynamic negotiation to adapt to opportunities, and that it all emerges from this interaction of students and teachers. That's the work that I've been doing in the last few years. Those are 2 books, and one big project that I've been involved in in the last 9 years, QD9SIM. It's done with schools around New York State, but we have a lot of stuff up on our website. You're welcome to look at it. There's a translanguaging guide and translanguaging videos of all kinds, and maybe adapt them to your own teaching. So again, working with it, making visible this translanguaging corriente just means working with the internal reality of the language of the students while touching those external language realities of institutions. For you as a teacher, what you have to do is learn to read the river. Know how to look out for the translanguaging current on the surface and below, right? So how do you find it and how do you move it so that students can move forward? And we talk about 3 strands of the translanguaging pedagogy, what we call the stance, the design, and the shifts. The shifts are simply the idea that all teaching has to be student-centered, so that you can design anything you want, but when you get to the classroom, and you know this, so I don't have to talk about it, you have to be able to shift. I don't think that anybody can develop a translanguaging classroom without a stance about translanguaging, about a stance that believes that the students that you have that are learning the language are not incomplete, they're not absent a piece. You know, we have had a lot about incomplete acquisition that we need to let go of, but that they're in full emergence, and that this emergence is in a continuum. The more opportunities, the more affordances we give them to use the language, the more that it's going to grow and develop. And the other thing is to remember that for them, you're adding what you see as a different language. But for them, what they're doing is they're expanding their repertoire, right? And this happens, what we call it the junto stance. The idea that you have to start with the language of the students and you have to add these new features so that they own them as their own. Not as a second language, not as a foreign language, but as their own. And how you design a classroom, I always say, it's sort of opening up these boxes that we have contained language in and allowing people to interact with whatever language resources they have at their disposal. And to remember that translanguaging, and this is important for me because I work in a particular context with minoritized students, that it is just not a scaffold, can't just be a scaffold. Scaffold is important, but it has to produce new bilingual subject positions. That's hard for people. Right? People want to teach Russian, and I don't know why I'm thinking of Russian, only because I spoke to Allah before, but whatever. People want to teach Chinese, and they want them to have a Chinese identity. No, these students are going to be Chinese speakers in the United States, so they have to develop these these bilingual subject identities. I draw from the African American scholar W.E. Du Bois, who a long time ago said that for African Americans education to be real, there has to be a transformative way of what he called lifting the veil, so that you can see yourself not as others see you, but as you yourself can see yourself, right? And I think it's the same thing for either people who are becoming bilingual, students who are becoming bilingual. In order for them to really appropriate this language that you're teaching them, they have to not compare themselves to the Korean speakers back in Korea, or to the Mexican speakers to the Spanish speakers back in Mexico, but to themselves. What makes sense for them to use the language here? So I'm just going to leave you with 4 principles, and which I think are important. One is to remember that by teaching them the language that you're teaching, the students are extending their repertoire. They have a richer repertoire. Now this is important because people are always thinking what they're missing. No, like Ella told me in the beginning, they have an extended repertoire. And they all of us translanguage and bilinguals have more linguistic features, with more complex socio-historical and socio-cultural histories, and we have to recognize that. So, a translanguaging pedagogy just recognizes this complexity and assists the students in assembling, I like the word assembling from Pennycook, in assembling these features and then selecting which are the appropriate ones to communicate. The second principle is that the repertoire that bilinguals have has to become unitary. They have, like all monolinguals, they construct a unitary repertoire, a dynamic inventory of features that are acquired through social interaction with listeners, and thus a pedagogy that adopts translanguages has to integrate these new language features so that speakers own them and doesn't separate them. The third principle is that to remember that translanguaging is always available. Whether you're seeing it or not, it's always with bilinguals. And a pedagogy that supports translanguaging really leverages all of this, engaging students in their own meaning-making inquiry with others, and differentiates between process and product. This is what I told you about before, of being able to differentiate, okay, the oral report to the class has to be in English only, but how you get there may be through using whatever resources you have, whether it's your own language or pictures or Google Translate or whatever. And then the fourth principle, which I think is important, is to remember that minoritized bilinguals especially have unequal access in schools because monolinguals can use their full repertoire, but bilinguals are seldom allowed to do so. That makes them then inferior according to the assessments. And a translanguage pedagogy does the opposite. It recognizes bilingual knowledge and then equalizes opportunities so that students do and show what they do. And I just want to tell you that this is not easy to do. It's easy to be traditional. I think we have failed as a country miserably in teaching languages, and it's time that we disrupt a little bit. It's an uphill battle. It's a battle that we have been fighting. We have a group with schools all around the state. And I hope more and more universities are joining this movement. I just came back from University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley, right at the border where our president was just. There is no way that they can even do things in English only or in Spanish only. Because if they do it in English only, there's someone who crossed the border yesterday, do it in Spanish only, there are fourth generation students. So that they are also working with translanguaging as a pedagogy to be able to give them content and to extend their bilingualism so that they become English speakers and Spanish speakers. I know, I think all around the world, and some of you who are international, you know that, and you have experience with this, know that in many universities, in most tertiary education, you know, the countries, especially sciences and math, are always taught with books in English, and then the students make sense of it with their own language practices. So that it's obvious that it's there. I don't know why we haven't recognized it in language education, and I hope that all of you take it up and you do something with it. Gracias.
Thank you, Ofelia.
You want to get up and stretch a bit? And I'm going to tell you what it was.
Okay, why don't we go get up, stretch a bit, get some cookies, refreshments, drinks over there as well, some coffee, and
a lot of questions now. Give me a hard time.
Really? No one?
Oh no, I'm sure, no, it just takes a little while, because this is so out there that people have to.
Chris, go ahead.
Chris.
Yeah.
Good.
So I mean, I see a lot of immediate applications for what you're saying for the context of elementary schools, public schools. But here we are at an Ivy League university teaching adults, and probably the closest sort of case we have is students who you would call heritage speakers on some level of that continuum. And a lot of these students, they come, you know, I don't suggest to them, they come with the explicit goal of essentially acquiring the prestige version of the language that they already know part of. So how do you respond to that when they come to you with that goal?
I think that that is a goal that we all have, otherwise you would be enrolling in your courses, right? So not only heritage speakers, but also students who are taking it as a foreign language, right? I mean, they always want the prestige, or I don't know, never know what that means, but I think I know what it means, but I will go there. But the question is not to give them access to that. The question is where you start. Remember, that's what I said. Where you start. Do you start by just ignoring what they already have and giving them only this? Or do you start with making sure that in your teaching you acknowledge, you use, you leverage what they already have in order to stretch it? Right? We're talking about expanding it. And the problem is that we have never in language education talked about expanding things. We talk about adding as if there was nothing there. Right? So, and you know that's impossible because all activity is partly social and partly cognitive. And you have to bring that you already know how to do in order to do better with a teach language. But that's a great question, and I'm glad you raised it because it's important to focus on that. Yes. Yes. Yes, Chris, okay?
Yes.
For now, yes.
It's kind of a related question. I have been trying to go in the direction you were talking about for the last years and seeing this much more as an impact, expanding capabilities that are already there and drawing on what students bring with them. My problem is that as a foreign language teacher, when you do that, you bring a lot of English into the classroom and they have a very limited time per week that they can spend on the foreign language, interacting in the foreign language. So for me, it's kind of difficult to balance how much English can I bring in and it's still productive, or how much of their other original languages that I might draw on in the process. And how much do I actually have to insist on using the foreign language exclusively?
Yeah. Teaching is an art, and always you're going to have to shift depending on the interaction with the students, right? So, you know, I'm glad that you raised the issue of English. So this has been my experience throughout, in many different contexts, internationally also, that that students, especially adults, know what they're there for. So they're not that keen to use English anyway. They are,
Sometimes.
but they're not that keen. But I think what you have to remember is that any teaching is about making sure, any learning is about having made meaning, right? If you don't make meaning, then there's no learning. So I would say you have to judge. You have to know when to put it in and when to take it out. And I think that is a dynamic relationship that only a teacher and the classroom, and it's very localized, and I don't think that there's a formula for it. I think what I'm saying is we don't have to be afraid of it. It already exists. I tell you, I don't know about your textbooks. I tell you that in secondary schools, the Spanish textbooks, which are the ones that I'm really familiar with, are full of English. Because to make sense of certain grammatical things or whatever, they do it all in English. So that it is a myth that it's all done in the other language. We're always facilitating meaning making. So the idea is when do you use it to facilitate meaning making and when you don't. So I think it's good for you to be cautious. I think it's a myth that immersion programs are entirely in the other language. Any good immersion teacher has a context in which that language is used, but also enables the students to make meaning with what they have. So if you, even if you go to Canada, to the immersion programs in Canada, you will see that the teacher might be speaking in one language, the kids are making meaning with whatever they have, right? And eventually, children and adults, and both of us are not stupid, especially if they're paying Columbia tuition. So they know what they want. So it's, I don't think you have to control it as much. I don't think you have to be afraid of it, but I do think you have to be able to use your intelligence. It can't be just in English only, right? Yes, I don't know.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think for me, like the traditional ways of teaching are very silencing the students, have been traditionally being silent. But right now, what you're telling us, what I understand is that we're giving voice to the students in either language that they choose to, and that's very important. Something that I've been reflecting in my teaching, this semester I'm teaching the first semester. And
As a foreign language?
yeah, Spanish is a foreign language. And what I notice is that my students, whenever they have a question, if they are able and they have the resources to speak and ask the question in Spanish, they will. But if they don't, they will just do it in English. And I think we have created a community in our classroom that's okay. And you don't hear them asking, can I ask in English? Can I ask in? So it's like they want to express themselves, they do it in the language that they have. And I think that's very powerful, like for them to be able to ask the question regardless of whether they have the level or not. It's important. But the question that I have for you is, I'm doing these practices in the classroom, I'm allowing the students to interact in the language that they choose, but when it comes to their, to the evaluation, to the midterms, we're having midterms next week, how is that going to play in the results of the exam?
I don't think that there's any effect, first of all. I think that we're not about to change assessments to make them translanguaged assessments. I want you to know that ETS, the Educational Testing Service, is actually starting to develop some tests with translanguaging where they have actually, there's no reason why they have tabs in the 2 languages or in the 3 languages and the 4 languages or whatever. PISA is not in 26 languages, so why not use it here in the United States also? And they then allow the students to reply in any language they choose. This is for content, all right? In any language they choose, and also either spoken or written. Because if you're assessing math, why are you assessing them in English only, right? So I think the problem is, what is the purpose of assessment? If the purpose of assessment is language performances, then of course you have to evaluate what they're doing in the target language, because that's the term you use, right? But it doesn't mean that as they do their exam in Spanish only, they are not constantly translanguaging to get to the Spanish. That's why I tell you that it's sometimes not visible, but it's there. And so we have to recognize it, it's there. Whether we like it or not, it's there, because it's theirs, right? So that's the idea. But you're right, the assessment, especially if that's what you're interested in. If you're interested in assessing how much Chinese they know, how much Korean they know, how much Russian they know, how much Spanish they know, then that has to be done. Having said that, I think assessments have to also change. Because especially standardized assessments are based on psychometric properties that I really think are not appropriate to measure language in this way. When we assess language as being just structures, you could have validity and reliability because we were thinking of whether they had the third person singular S, something like that. But once you're talking about language as the ability to narrate a story, now that's difficult. There's no psychometric principles that are going to help you there. So that is one problem with standardized tests. Classrooms assessments, though, can work that in, right? So teachers' assessments can work that in, right? I mean, you can, I know in South Africa they often have the prompts in different languages, even though they know they have to write in one. But the prompts, and that makes a difference. In other words, giving the directions in the different languages makes us, you know, we know from a lot of research that that makes a difference. So that they know that they can pull from it. Sorry. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk. As you were talking about the immersion,
Yeah.
and this idea that the students really don't use anything else but the language, the direct language in the immersion. I was thinking about the Middlebury College language program, where they have to sign a paper that they say that they will not the pledge, that they will not use any other language or language for learning. It's a very successful. I know some students that have done this. I teach Portuguese. Some students that have taken Portuguese and that have been very successful in Portuguese and they didn't do that. But what are your ideas about this?
I want to say that having a space in which you have to make sense of what you're saying in that other language and in which you're listening, your comprehensible input is in that language, I think is very important. I don't believe for a second that that's all that is happening. I have been in so many classrooms where they tell you this is an immersion program and therefore it's more expensive than anything else, right? I mean, they charge for the word immersion. And yet you go in there, you sit down, and half hour into the lesson, it's gone. Because, you know, you're teachers. You have to make sure that your students have meaning. So of course we're teaching in the language that the target language, which is important. Of course you're using that language for them to, but once in a while, you have, you know, what I've always wondered about is, we talk about foreign language, I hate foreign language, but foreign language instruction being, you're supposed to use gestures, you're supposed to use visuals, you're supposed to use music, you're supposed to use acronyms. But then the most important meaning-making system that students have, which is their language, we never use it. And I've been in classrooms where one word, and that's it, and then you can continue in the other language. But they needed that word in order to make sense of what was happening. So, you know, I'm cautious about the pledges, because I've also met a lot of people that have signed the pledge. And of course, you know, it's more or less, you know, more or less. I think the idea always is flexibility, right? To know, and I think for all of us to give ourselves permission to use this other meaning-making system that students have when we're teaching them another language, which we're afraid to use. And that's what we fail. Because to learn, you have to make meaning of what you learn. You have to engage as if it's yours, not as if it's someone else, not as if it's foreign, not as if it's heritage. It's your own. Okay, come on, challenge me some more. Yes?
Could you share one or two successful fights in your uphill battle? You mentioned uphill battle, right? I guess when you work on the project, right?
In the project? I can tell you, for example, this semester we're working in a school called Dos Puentes, which is in Washington Heights. It's a dual language school, English and Spanish. They have always had separation completely, one day in English, one day in Spanish, with two separate teachers. The two separate teachers didn't know what the child was doing in English, and the other one didn't know what the child was doing in Spanish. There was no way of holistically assess the child. And I have given up on changing the world. I can only think of what exists that I can disrupt a little bit, right? So I listen to the principal and the teachers, and they have something called social studies inquiry. So twice a week, they do this social studies inquiry, which emerges from the students. So we started there, right? So what we're doing is we're having the students themselves do a study of the language in their community, where the teachers are together and the children are together. And the idea is that instead of, because what happens usually is in this classroom, you have resources only in Spanish. In this classroom, you have resources only in English. So what would happen if in one classroom, you put all the resources at their disposal? How do they make sense of that? How do they use all of that? So that's what we've been doing. And they are doing community studies. The parents were there this morning. So that's, I think, one very successful example. I'll tell you, last semester, we worked in an ESL program. It was all in English, where there were students of different language groups. And the teacher didn't speak any of those languages. So I'll give you an elementary school example and a high school example. I'll start with a high school example. These students were labeled SIFE, which in New York City means students with interrupted formal education. We're getting many students at the high school level with very low literacy in their own languages. Students in New York State have to pass an English language Regents in order to graduate. The English language Regents is difficult for students who are newly arrived, and doubly difficult for the students who are labeled as SIFE. And we started working with the teacher on translanguaging, and she started grouping the students differently so that they could come together and work through Spanish, through French. Thank God for French as a colonial language, because all the Francophone African kids can do it in French. In Polish, that school had Polish, Urdu, so we were able to do that. Before the end of the semester, the Spanish-speaking group said to the teacher, we are going, I could even show you, we are going to make a video for you so that you can play it for the next year, as to how to pass the English Regents. Now, the video was in Spanish, and basically it said, the first thing you do is you read the question. Second, you translate it into Spanish. Third, you make annotations in the margin in Spanish. Fourth, you write the essay in Spanish. Fifth, you try to turn it into English. So, I mean, there it was. It was incredible. I mean, and this was the student. I can tell you about another Andy Brown, a teacher in an elementary school in 4th grade, who became really transfixed with this idea. And he had all kinds of languages in the classroom. And he decided, well, on his own, he said, okay, what I'm going to do, he had signs on his walls, right? Like, elementary school teachers have like desk, wall, that kind of thing, right? And so he decided he was going to translate those signs into the 6 languages. There were 5 other languages and English. So he was going to translate all the signs. So he translated all the signs and he put them up. And then the mothers started coming in, especially the Chinese mothers did not like the Chinese backwards. And the Arabic, because the Arabic, if you put it into Google Translate, you get a mess. So they all came, so all of a sudden, this became a family event. It wasn't just he and the kids. Now, what Andy did was every day, because he had, the other thing that he did is he found reading material in all the languages. Parents contributed, parents made bake sales to get money to buy books in the different languages. One of them had the idea of, what if we take the stories? And what was interesting about that, so there was a listening center with the stories that they read, the books that they read in the 6 languages. And what I always was fascinated by was the Spanish-speaking kids were listening to the Chinese tape, the Chinese-speaking kids were listening to the Korean. It was like amazing to me. They were, and then the other thing he used to do was, in New York City classrooms, there's something called the to-do. You feel proud if you went to high school here, you know about that? And they always write the to-do first, right? And he always did the to-do in 2 of the languages, in English and then 2 other languages. He always had it wrong, of course, because he used to do it through Google Translate. And he would then have the kids who spoke that language read the to-do. Then he had all of the kids repeat after the kids. And then he would say, is it right? And of course they would say, no. And so he had them teach. So this became such an engaging activity, you wouldn't believe it. And for Andy, it was mind-boggling because he was so bored teaching 4th grade. And all of a sudden, he had this, he was so interested in all these languages and all these. So it takes a little bit more work, can happen. I think, again, if we don't work not only with the speakers, but also with the listeners, and that's why I thought Andy's way of doing things was important, because he made the rest of the kids, the English-speaking kids also, become comfortable with those languages. That was important. Okay, yes. Our Swahili man.
The issue that I see also with L1, the L1 that says English, but there are so many Englishes.
Yeah.
Now, how do you use that? And how do you apply that from the L1 going to L2, where you have several Englishes? Right?
You have several languages, several Swahili, several Spanishes, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Right.
I'm saying. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that, to me, Bakhtin said it best, right? He talked about language being heteroglossic, right? That is not just one thing, that is many things. Even if you're monolingual, right? There are different elements within this language. So all language is heteroglossic. All language is diverse. There is no such thing as one language. It's just that schools have taught us to believe that that this thing that they teach us in school is what the language is. And this thing that they teach us in school is often not what the language is. It's very different. Like you say, an English lesson might be an English lesson, but what all the English speakers that speak English don't engage in it the same way. Remember what I said, there are no L1s and no L2s.
That's why I brought up the issue.
Yeah. Okay, come on.
I'll ask you a question.
Yes.
Go ahead, Ellen.
Thank you so very much. There was a lot to process, so it's very difficult to come up with the questions right now. I just want to ask about some spots that I can think of now. You several times in your lecture you said that you don't like these labels, native speaker, non-native speaker, heritage, foreign language. And I can understand that. Is that from the socio-linguistic position when you're talking about identity? And there is a lot of literature right now, and there's a good bank right now of written of oral interviews, oral stories of people of different heritage. And whenever they ask question, I remember one, how much there was an English Latino person, and how much of you, what's the percentage? And the answer of this person was relative. She said, I cannot tell that, but I am a whole in which there is both.
Right.
But and as an identity, from the point of view of identity, I can understand that. Even if just talking about Russian heritage speakers, you ask them what they are, American or Russian, they don't. And I have a different way to ask these questions. When you talk about Americans, are Americans they, or are Americans us? And that's also a different just shape form of this question. But when we talk about the past in the language, when we talk about the language past, so one past is a native, and past of, how do I put it? So a past of a native speaker, a past of a foreign learner, a past of a heritage learner or speaker. So what, I guess that's my question to you. Also say, no, that's not acceptable.
So, I think the problem is that we're teaching these languages not because they're in the past, but because they're in the future, right? So we want to be able to make sure that students don't think, well, it's just, this is your ancestry and therefore you have to know about it, but because you're going to bring them forth into the future. So that's one thing. Secondly, when you're as old as I am, you've seen it all. So heritage, the term heritage, I'll tell you about the term heritage. Because the term heritage was always used in Canada for a long time, right? Since the official Bilingual Act in Canada, 1970, 74, I think, heritage became a word. It was never used in the United States, never. In the United States, we talked about bilingual speakers or bilingual students. Even when Guadalupe Valdez started working on teaching these students, she called them teaching bilingual students because that's what they were. Then came No Child Left Behind, 2002, very important in terms of how we defined ourselves as a country, and certainly educational policy. And when bilingual was eliminated, we came upon this term which had been used in Canada a lot, heritage, right? Now, it's not that I mean, I have no other way of calling people, these students, so I'm okay with heritage. But I have a sense of, it's not my heritage, it's me now. Spanish is not my heritage language. Spanish is my language, just like English is my language. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I have a little reaction to heritage because it's not in the past. It's in me, it's in my children, my grandchildren, it's in the future. So that's what the objection to heritage is. But I don't know. Now native, I think, is a problem because I can see native born. I can have been native born in Cuba, right? I mean, I can see that. But which is my native language? I'm a bilingual American, right? And that I don't want to be told that I have one native language and one non-native language. These are my languages. This is part of me. So that's the idea.
I didn't mean past as in past there.
Oh.
I meant a way in the, like a way
Oh,
in
yeah.
the language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm sorry.
So the way you come, maybe we're talking about adult learners who we have at the college level here. Mm-hmm. So the way they have come to this position, or to this situation. That's what I'm thinking. And well, heritage as bilingual, well, I think the difficulty to me with the word bilingual is that but following Guadalupe Valdez, that the existence of any language in the system makes no difference how much of the language you have makes you a bilingual. You can be called a bilingual.
The problem is there are dichotomies, right? Monolingual, bilingual. Because this is all a continuum, right?
Yes, continuum.
It's all a continuum, and it's a continuum of practices. And you know that perhaps those students that you call heritage, if they only understand, they can do some tasks, but if you ask them to write, they can't do it. So we are all in this emergence, we're all in this continuum all the time. Because even those of us who think we're really bilingual, there are some tasks, I always say I'm emergent in computer science, So there are some tasks that I cannot do, and so that's the idea, right? Yeah. Okay. Yes, I'm sorry, Stefan had a question.
Let me begin by thanking you for your talk. I just want to reflect a little bit perhaps on the relationship or the tension between the individual and the collective. As a teacher, I have a certain independence to do what I want in the classroom,
Right.
including embracing teaching practices that are translingual in nature. But my students will eventually be passed on to someone else within a program, within a curriculum. And if these other teachers or the next person doesn't embrace the same ideology, then what happens to these students as they're kicked around between one ideology or another? I mean, I am working within the yoke, the frame, the straitjacket, if you want to call it, of a program.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem whatever you do. I mean, you have a child in 2nd grade with a progressive teacher who's very child-centered, and then you go into the 3rd grade and the teacher wants you to sit at the desk and read and write, and that's it. No child-centeredness, and that's a problem. And that's why if education works as a collective, and these are things that have to be done little by little. That's why I say, when I start with working with a system and I work with the whole school, I work with one little thing, and that's it. Because I know I can't change everything. I can only change a little bit and hope that that opens up paths for others. But, you know, and another thing that I do, which I think I've been very successful at, is do what I call collaborative descriptive inquiry with all school staffs. And that's a process I learned to do with teachers a million years ago. But what we do is we come around a piece of work. The child, you know, has done an essay in French. And we look at it together, and everybody has a turn. We do this with teachers, principals, and if we can, some parents. Because one thing that it does is it calls into question expertise. It makes you very humble when you hear mothers who have, you're told, are not literate or not, and they come up with things that they see in that drawing that you have never seen before, or in that essay. So it's a way of, over time, building a generous collaborative space that moves institutions. But you have to do it as a group, you're right. Otherwise it's hit or miss, right? But you know, I want to say before I take you, I want to say that there are Angel Lin, who's from Hong Kong, once heard me a million years ago talk about this, and she said to me, we've been doing this for 100 years in Hong Kong. How do you think we get all our Chinese students to speak English? We do it because we do this way. But we don't describe it, because if we described it, the language scholars would tell us that you know, you're doing it wrong. So we close the door and we do it. And so that's, you know, so I think it's giving ourselves permission to be a little bit more flexible sometimes. Someone had their hand raised.
Yes, Professor, in answering to Stefan's question, you mentioned the word student-centered, and in your talk you also mentioned student-centered. And I, for one, always have trouble with these two terms, student-centered and teacher-centered. It seems to me, from my conversation with a lot of frontline teachers and then authorities, you know, professors who teach second language acquisition, it seems to me that people have different, like, visions or imagination about these two terms. And I always have trouble, one way or another, that to have a second language acquisition expert tell me that you can only do teacher-centered or you can only do student-centered. Like, there's only one right way. So I would love for you to clarify these two terms for me, like in your envision. Like,
so you heard me talk about abyssal thinking and the fact that, you know, we always look at one thing and not the other. I think that the reason why I emphasize student-centered is because so much, especially foreign language education, has been teacher-centered, and we need the input from the teachers because they're the ones that have the language, so we need it. But you then have to make sure that the students practice it themselves. So again, I think it's not one or the other. I think it has to be both in combination, depending, and that's why the shifts, remember I talked about the shifts are very, very important. I think the reason why some of us emphasize the student-centeredness is because so much of foreign language teaching, it has been teacher-centered. We know that there has to be a balance, that both have to occur. So you're right, you have to make sure that there's, especially if you're teaching a language that you're the only one that holds the language, right? You have to be teacher-centered in some ways, but then you have to get them to perform among themselves, group in some ways, so that they're acting out the language, not just being receptive receptacles. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Also, is it fair to say that there is a paradigm shift taking place in the field of bilingualism? Because there seems to be such signs in the field of second language
There's
acquisition.
a paradigm shift going on, big time. I think, I think Stephen May called it the multilingual turn, and I think that is important. Because all these languages are now visible and audible, right? We have access to them, whereas before, unless you met a person, you traveled someplace else, you didn't hear them. Whereas now, you hear them everywhere. In New York City, fantastic, but even in other places, because virtually you can be in touch with them. So one thing that technology has done is it's made them visible. They come to the surface, right? So this multilingual turn is important. There's been more recognition of it.
And also the dynamic turn. Right?
Dynamic also, right. Well, because I do think that we're in a different era, right? When I started studying all of these questions, we were coming out, or we were, from what Fishman called the rise and fall of the ethnic revival. Right? What did that have to do with anything? It was that during our civil rights era in the United States, all over the world, there were language minorities that claimed their language rights, right? So Maoris in New Zealand, Bretons in France, Gallegos and Bascos and Catalans in Spain, etc., claimed language rights, right? So indigenous Australians, Latin America declared many of their changed the constitutions, calling them multilingual. So there was this ethnic revival, ethnic movement. As the world has changed, as I think, again, more technology, more movement. We have had movement of people, goods, ideas, asylum seekers, refugees, everybody moving at the same time. The dynamics of place have changed, because it used to be that languages were situated. Chinese was in China, I don't know, Spanish was in Mexico, right? And then all of a sudden everybody started coming together, and so the place, the situatedness of language has changed. And that's where the dynamic has come in, and I think you're right about that. Then I think the third shift has been possibly the idea of thinking of the listening subject. Because I think for many, many years we were only focused on the speaker. And it's how we listen that interacts with the speaker. I think that's a big shift. I think lately, one of my ex-doctoral students has come up with this racial linguistic ideologies. I think that is going to impact the field greatly. The idea of how people who have been racialized are listened to, and therefore the power dynamics of language. I think that probably one of the most important, impactful studies in this generation, your generation, is a book by Sinfri Makoni, who's South African, Zambian really, but he lived in South Africa, with Alastair Pennycook, that is called Disinventing Languages. And there he traces the naming of languages that took place as the work of missionaries came here and there, and the artificiality of all of it, right? And so this disruption of new languages has also come into the fore. So paradigm shifts, big paradigm shifts. Language education is slow to come to it, but I think it's coming along. So, you know, a little bit at a time. Yes, Stefan.
We kind of pick up on this and perhaps try to recast this in broader terms, in terms of the language crisis we're experiencing right now. I feel a little bit like scholastic scholars counting angels on the head of a pin here. When I read that the Free University in Amsterdam is no longer going to be offering a bachelor degree in Dutch, what are we talking about here? I mean, the big elephant in the room is English.
Yeah. You're right. But at the same time, I think that the spread of English around the world has facilitated our understanding of bilingualism differently. Because now the elite the elite were always bilingual. But if you go to any conference in Europe, for example, all the Europeans speak English, right? And so all of a sudden, they have helped us, I think, counteract the idea of the native speaker, etc. You know, I think things have been done jointly and not separately, and I think we have benefited some from the spread of English and pushing back on it at the same time. So, no, but you're right. I mean, certainly the growth of multilingualism has to do with the spread of English. Absolutely. But because there are white Europeans spreading English, somehow bilingualism has caught on differently. And I think that's important.
But to go back to your image of a current, there is a surface current of English, but Amsterdam and Holland is a very multicultural and even multilingual society. And that's continuing to diversify, actually, while the accepted way of teaching in Holland is becoming more and more in English. They're no longer opening master programs in Dutch. All master programs are taught in English. The same is true in Scandinavian countries. I mean, it's...
Yeah, in Germany, yeah, all over. all over. And the places like the Basque country that had opened up Spanish Basque language programs, bilingual programs, now have trilingual programs, so English has been added. Everybody wants English, and you know, I'm tired of fighting, you know, I'm tired of fighting against it. I don't think we're going to stop it. But I think what we have to do is then protect the rest of the languages and make sure that English doesn't take over. You know, my colleague Thomas Kupnakangas used to talks all the time about killer English, and she talks about linguistic genocide. Well, you know, I think the way to oppose the killer English instinct is precisely to pick up on this translanguaging thing. Because the issue is, what is the future of multilingualism? I see it every day in classrooms where kids are told, you are not speaking Spanish, you're speaking Spanglish. You're speaking this incorrectly. That is the kiss of death for second generation, third generation speakers. So unless we're a little bit flexible with it, we won't be able to extend it. So, you know, when my grandchildren say all kinds of things, right? I mean, I have a video of my grandson saying, oh, la muñeca está sico. You know, I couldn't figure out what sico meant, and of course it was sick, but sico, because you know, oh, really, está enferma. So, but unless you do that, you say, oh no, you don't say sico, which is what teachers do. And that's why the listening subject is so important, right? to me. If we're going to have a multilingual future as a nation, I think we have to change the terms by which we speak about it. So.
Are there any other questions? We do need to vacate this room, and on this inspiring and disruptive note, I would like to thank Ofelia for